I really do. I just today came from an assessment workshop held over the lunch hour, and this is run by a new assessment unit that was just created as part of the Center for Enhancement of Teaching and Learning at HKU. Um, and their workshops tend to draw a pretty good crowd, and it's a mix of tutors and sort of regular faculty members. They like to draw some of the senior faculty in as kind of experts, but actually some of the more useful and insightful comments come from the tutors, who are sort of down there in the trenches.
Right, right.
But one thing that emerged today, one of the tutors mentioned that in her unit, which I think was in the medical school, that the faculty who had experience this year teaching in the Common Core were promoting new approaches to teaching and learning. And
into the majors, as it were.
Into the majors.
From GE outward.
Right.
Into the, yes.
So, for instance, the Common Core faculty in that unit have now volunteered to help redesign their first and second year required courses in the program, focusing much more on active learning, on a much more diverse array of assessment instruments. And so that was a interesting development. It suggests that Common Core is serving as a kind of incubator for innovation, which will then spread to other units.
It's within the university, it's cross-cutting to all units, so everybody's exposed to it.
Which is one reason why I think it's very good that HKU, at Chinese U, they have a very different model, and it's a very interesting model, but the two sort of really core courses are taught by faculty hired into a specialized unit that doesn't, they're not seeded through the institution. And so that limits the ability of innovation in gen ed to influence teaching and learning practices elsewhere in the institution. Well, I think the one that I consider primary, sort of above all the others, because it's an end in itself. Some of them are means to an end, but the one that I consider an end in itself and the most critical, most important, is critical thinking. And I think that that is a mindset. It's a way of learning that if we can help students to sort of make this progression, sort of climb this ladder to become critical thinkers, that will allow them to become lifelong learners. And that's what we want. It's not just a matter of memorizing information. It's a matter of learning to analyze it in a critical way. And so that's the most crucial one. And the $64,000 question is, how do you help students move to that level? A talk I heard recently suggested that that even at Harvard, that only about 2% of the graduates had actually achieved genuine critical thinking. So if that's true, then you might think we're up against it.
But you've seen it.
But it has to be our aspiration.
Have you seen it happen in while you've been here, where in a sense students get it, or teachers get it, or in a sense embrace it as a desirable goal?
Yeah. Well, I think it comes in part by trusting the students to take responsibility for their own learning. I'll give you an example of a project that I think involved critical thinking that I used this semester. It wasn't a Common Core course. It was a major course in politics major, but it was a group project related to the theme of globalization. We were talking about various concepts, theories, debates surrounding globalization. What I decided to do, though, is to find a way to relate those to something concrete in students' everyday lives. And so we looked at the global life cycle of an iPhone. And the purpose was to link that to the concept of globalization. If there's a global commodity, it would be the iPhone. It's produced from raw materials in production sites around the world, distributed globally. It connects people globally. So I thought let's examine the debate over globalization through the prism of the iPhone. And in particular, we linked it as well to the concept of corporate social responsibility, because I want students to be able to connect their learning, to see the relevance of their learning, not only to their personal lives, to their professional lives, but also to issues pertaining to the common good. And so the question is, what responsibilities and duties does a corporation have toward the impact of its activities? So briefly, it was a small class, 12 students. I divided them into groups of 4 each, and one looked at conflict minerals, the raw materials that come out of, in some cases, the Congo region and help fuel warfare and conflict there, that go into smartphones like the iPhone. The second group looked at labor issues in the production of iPhone, particularly in Guangdong and in China, where at Foxconn, for instance, where there's been some controversies surrounding safety and working conditions. And then we even visited a factory, electronics factory. It did not produce iPhones, but it produced electronics in Dongguan. And then the third group looked at electronic waste, what happens when iPhone gets disposed. And again, there's some real issues regarding the health and safety of people who take these phones apart and on the environment. So the students, I said, I'm not teaching you this because I really don't know much about this topic myself. I'm going to design a project, and then you become the experts. And I asked them to become investigative journalists. So they went and tried to make contact with Apple representatives, some of the suppliers, some of the e-waste groups. In fact, they went down to the offices of the e-waste group, kind of a 60 Minutes Mike Wallace kind of confrontation, which they recorded. Of course, they didn't get any information, but that told them something about how the level of accountability of private corporations. They did a public. I said, if we're going to learn about this, we need to externalize it and share it with others. So we did a public presentation, and then they also did a blog on the web, and 30 different entries. So I was very proud of the students, but there's a case where they took charge of their own learning. I told them there's no preconceived, conclusions about this. You might find that Apple's a paragon of corporate virtue, or you might find that it's so whatever conclusions you come to is fine. And but I think that by putting responsibility on them for their learning, that's a way of encouraging critical thinking.
Students respond to this.
Yeah, it doesn't guarantee critical thinking, but it allows for that possibility. Well, thinking about what are some of the commonalities across the general education programs here in Hong Kong and many back in the States as well, I think of it not so much in terms of what topical areas are covered or disciplines or that kind of thing, but instead what are the characteristics common to a course. And I think there are 4 major ones. One is interdisciplinarity or multidisciplinarity. And here the challenge is always, how do faculty who are trained to be specialists in not just a discipline but a subdiscipline, how do they prepare themselves to help students see that problems in the real world are almost always interdisciplinary and have to be approached from multiple disciplines? So that is one. I mean, an important element of GE, philosophy of GE, is integration of knowledge across areas. So a second is that content is not king in general education. It's not clear that it necessarily ought to always be king in other areas as well, but certainly in general education, the learning goals include students' attitudes, their values, their skills, things other than just the course content. Content is more of a vehicle for helping to promote learning in these other areas than it is an end in itself. After all, in many cases, this will be the last course the student takes on that topic. It's not preparing them for a sequence of further learning in this particular area. A third element of GE courses, I think, should be, as I mentioned before, knowledge for the common good. Let's get students thinking not solely in terms of their personal, professional goals. Of course, those are important. I'm not saying that students ought to be, so selfless that they're not concerned with that. But if that's all they're concerned with, then I think they're missing an opportunity to develop a meaningful philosophy of life that's about something bigger than themselves. And that has to involve, I think, drawing connections between what they're learning and the good of the communities, local, national, global, that they're a part of. And then finally, I think that students typically come from high school, not all of them, but many of them come to high school with the frame of mind of a passive learner, of soaking up information to be spat back on an exam. And I think that general education offers an opportunity, especially since it's sort of front-loaded in their education the first year or two. It offers an opportunity to help move them from passive to active learning. And hopefully then that will carry over into and help facilitate higher levels of learning in their major.